When Congress declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, the country scrambled to provide troops for the war effort and train them for military duty overseas. The government first encouraged young men to volunteer for service through an intensive recruitment campaign. And then instituted a draft to fill the needed quotas. Both the call for volunteers and the draft process included the African American community in an unprecedented way, and the community responded enthusiastically. Bishop J. M. Connor of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Arkansas and Oklahoma said,
"Side by side with white men, we're going to fight for our country. Yes, die for it. In this crisis in American history, we should forget our creeds, classes, colors, and conditions, and stand out for Americanism, unsullied, untrammeled, and undismayed."
The Selective Service Law became effective in May of 1917 and required all men between the ages of 21 and 31 years to register for military service. A supplementary act of Congress in August 1918 extended the draft to all men between the ages of 18 and 45. By the end of the war, approximately 2 million men volunteered and another 2.8 million were drafted into service. To prepare the new soldiers, the War Department constructed 32 training camps, or cantonments, around the country. Each cantonment had the capacity to house 40,000 to 50,000 men, plus staff. A government operation of that size had the potential to bring millions of dollars in revenue to an area, so patriotism coupled with a potential economic boost caused a great deal of competition as cities across the country showcased potential campsites to the government. The Little Rock Board of Commerce submitted a proposal to locate one of the camps across the river near North Little Rock, or Argenta as the area was known at that time. Reflecting on what it took to get the camp, W.B. Smith, former president of the Little Rock Board of Commerce, wrote,
"During this strenuous period, when the location of the camp was in doubt, the committee took up and had presented to the War Department, as well as the Southeastern Department, the advantageous location of Little Rock from a railroad standpoint. In other words, the strategy of the location and the importance of distributing cantonments over the country so as not to congest railroad traffic, especially during the seasons when the crops of the South had to move. We laid special stress upon the fact that there were a large number of camps already located east of the Mississippi River, and that the Missouri Pacific Railroad and the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad were government land grant lines, entitling the government to the transportation of troops and supplies free."
Leading businessmen from both sides of the river formed the Army Post Development Company and initially raised $300,000 to purchase 3,000 acres of land for the Army camp, lease additional property for the maneuvering grounds, and to fund improvements needed to make the site more attractive to the government. In the end, the government received nearly $500,000 worth of free assets for the camp.
There were concerns, however, about the site. One was good water. Was there a good water supply? It didn't appear there might be. The other thing was there wasn't a railroad that went through the area, but there was one that was close. And believe it or not, the one that really got them, and it was really questioned by authorities, was there were a lot of malaria, apparently a malaria-carrying mosquitoes out there.
The city's offer to donate the land proved to be a winning strategy, and on June 11, 1917, the War Department announced its intention to spend $3.5 million to build the Arkansas camp, which would be home to the 87th Division of the U.S. Army. The War Department named the camps for famous American soldiers and chose people who were somehow connected to the locations of the individual camps. The Arkansas camp was named for Zebulon Montgomery Pike, who explored the Louisiana Purchase territory in 1806. Major John Fordyce served as construction quartermaster to oversee the project. Fordyce was a successful Little Rock businessman and inventor who held a reserve commission in the Army Engineer Corps. The Army awarded the contract to build the camp to James Stewart and Company of St. Louis and New York, and the race was on to complete the camp in time to accommodate the first round of draftees. Engineering News Record reported that the planned 1,600 buildings would require more than 32 million feet of lumber. Construction began almost immediately, and the first building was completed on June 26th, just 15 days after the War Department chose the site. This feat was nothing short of amazing, given that nothing existed at the campsite. Workers had to be hired, roads had to be built, and railroad tracks from Argenta had to be expanded to create a spur line to the camp. Today, it's hard to imagine a construction project that doesn't involve power tools, motorized vehicles, and large equipment. But Camp Pike was built with manual labor, wagons, and teams of horses or mules. Until the railroad spur was completed, all of the supplies had to be hauled in by wagon. And even after the spur was installed, men worked long hours unloading the materials and transporting them around the campsite. Raymond Brazelton of Pope County recalled,
"During World War I, Dad got a contract at Camp Pike, and we went down there and stayed for 4 or 5 months. There were a lot of men there and about 2,500 teams of mules and horses. Each wagon had to have a number on it, and my number was 2,100. We hauled lumber from the railroad to camp and would unload 2 train loads a day."
In a progress report dated July 23, 1917, John Fordyce wrote,
Missouri Pacific Railway has completed construction of temporary unloading tracks. Capacity 90 cars. Lumber is now being delivered at approximately 100 cars a day. In fact, a little faster than we can unload economically and distribute.
The water system for the camp used more than 50 miles of pipe to carry more than 2.2 million gallons of water each day. Workers came from all over Arkansas and surrounding states, as well as Puerto Rico. Thousands of workers rushed to build enough barracks, mess halls, storehouses, and other essential operations buildings to accommodate the first wave of men.
For the most part, the work in Puerto Rico, again, we talked about, but for the most part, we're talking about local. And that helped the economy, but local workers.
The first group of draftees arrived at the partially completed camp on September 5, 1917, and construction continued until the summer of 1918. When the number of troops outnumbered the accommodations, incoming soldiers lived in tents pitched around the camp. Camp Pike quickly became the second largest population center in the state, and at times rivaled Little Rock for the top spot. The camp was divided into sections for housing with hundreds of 2-story barracks, administrative and service areas, a large remount depot where the horses and mules were trained and cared for, the medical and hospital compound, and the quartermaster's warehouse depot where supplies and provisions were stored. Additionally, many support organizations built buildings in and around the camp. The Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, had 18 buildings scattered around the camp, and the Knights of Columbus also constructed 2 halls to provide religious services and entertainment. The American Library Association provided books for library buildings. St. Joseph Orphanage stood empty outside the main camp because the Catholic diocese decided to move the orphans to Little Rock, away from the training maneuvers. The diocese allowed a group of businessmen to refit the building as the Hotel Belmont to provide rental living quarters for officers with families and for visitors who traveled to the camp to see family members. A small community known as Belmont grew around the hotel, offering all kinds of businesses and services targeted to the military men.
Up to mighty London came an Irish lad one day.
While Camp Pike was under construction, men across the country were preparing to leave home and enter training camps.
Square, till Paddy got excited, then he shot.
They gathered at courthouses to be sworn in and boarded trains that would take them to their new temporary homes as crowds of townspeople gathered to give them a big send-off. One of those new soldiers, Harry Standifer, wrote in his memoir,
142 young men from all over Garland and Montgomery counties answered this call and gathered at the Garland County Courthouse to be sworn in mass. My brother Edgar had gone to Hot Springs the day before and volunteered at the local recruiting office. Accompanied by the city and county officials and hundreds of the townspeople, we marched some 20 blocks to the Union Pacific Railroad station. This event, the first ever in that part of the United States, had been given advanced publicity, and the sidewalks were crowded with the curious and the well-wishers. The voices of those marching with us resounded with "Over There" and "Tipperary."
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go.
The girls gave us hugs and kisses and addresses with requests to write.
I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell.
When they arrived at Camp Pike, the recruits immediately began acclimating to Army life. Harry Standifer said,
We reached camp at midnight. I don't remember why all the delay. The contingent of 160 men were divided into 2 groups and marched to 2 recently finished barracks. Steel cots, mattresses, and blankets were stacked in one corner of the second floor. The regular Army sergeant assigned our group instructed us to set up our own bunks. He soon let us know who was boss and forbade any noise for the remainder of the night.
The soldiers were hastily outfitted with their gear, and many rushed to have photographs made to send to the folk back home to reassure them they had arrived safely.
Girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square.
In February 1918, the first groups of African American soldiers began to arrive at the camp, including 1,100 from Arkansas. The men didn't have much time to get used to their new home before training began.
The second day, the process began of hardening our muscles. Our first march into the country was about 6 miles round trip. The distance was increased each day until we were marching 20 miles round trip. An ambulance always went along to pick up those who fell by the wayside. I had spent a good part of my life walking behind a mule and a plow, and the hikes never bothered me.
The men trained 6 days a week to learn how to march as units, mastering the weapons they would be using in Europe, and learning specialty skills such as signaling. The Arkansas Gazette reported, "Just west of this camp is the training ground where crater work can be exemplified. Here the ground has been cleared, and dozens of holes resembling shell craters have been made, where the men get the same conditions as those existing on a shell-torn field at the front. Just beyond this is the proving ground for automatic guns, the bombing and grenade field. Nearby are the bayonet runs with their pitfall trench systems and improvised Huns occupying unenviable positions in direct line of attack." Next to the bayonet runs are the grounds for training men in horsemanship with their hurdle breaks and barrel jumps. These grounds are in close proximity to the Great Trench System constructed by the 87th Division. Mastering trench warfare was another essential skill for infantrymen. How to lay them out, how to dig them, and how to fight from them. Elaborate trench systems crisscrossed the battlefields, and by the end of the war, each side had dug more than 12,000 miles of trenches. The soldiers also learned to protect themselves from a new threat, chemical warfare that used deadly gases such as chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas. Knowing how to properly use a gas mask and how to repair it in the field could mean the difference between life or death. 4 officers from the French Army came to Camp Pike and spent several months working with the men to help them understand the conditions they would face on the front lines. J.H. Atkinson, who trained at Camp Pike, wrote home,
"One cannot help being impressed with the stern, businesslike way in which our army is being made. Yesterday we got up at 5 o'clock, and at the time, company after company was marching by. They had already had breakfast and were about their work. Officers and men alike, up against the same proposition, are toiling away in dirt, dust, and heat, each seeming to realize that no one is to blame for his being there, each feeling no resentment toward the other, but looking on the situation as one that had to come."
The African American soldiers at Camp Pike went through the same training as their white counterparts. For the most part, the two groups trained independently and without incident. One notable exception led to the court-martial of a white officer who refused to bring his men to formation alongside African Americans. Troops at Camp Pike were ordered to march their men to the drill area each morning, with the battalions lining up in numerical order, which interspersed the African American troops with the white ones. Captain Eugene Rowan refused to have his men line up in this manner and was arrested. Rowan wrote to a senator from his home state of Mississippi,
"Colonel F.B. Shaw ordered Negro soldiers to march together. I refuse for my company. I am under arrest awaiting court-martial. Each day, white and Negro soldiers are forced to stand retreat in same company, shoulder to shoulder. White privates are forced to cook for Negro soldiers. Has this officer the rights to force white and Negro soldiers to drill together?"
In another piece of correspondence, Rowan wrote,
"In some companies, there are white privates and Negro non-commissioned officers. In practically all of the Negro companies, white privates are forced to cook for the Negroes. These white privates are in the same kitchens with Negro cooks who rank as sergeants."
Rowan was found guilty of willful disobedience for refusing the order of a superior officer and was dismissed from the service. The incident attracted national attention because it was the first case in which racial discrimination had factored into a case against a white officer. The Army moved forward, and when the War Department established 3 training camps for African American officer candidates, Camp Pike was selected as the training center for infantry officers. Keeping the Army fed required training men to cook in bulk. The camp school for bakers taught recruits how to make thousands of pounds of bread. The Army didn't skimp on keeping the troops well fed. Atkinson wrote,
"A typical breakfast consisted of steak, potatoes, rice, bread, butter, and coffee. The evening meal generally included fried bacon, canned salmon, potato salad, a vegetable, bread, butter, and preserved fruit."
When they weren't training, the soldiers could enjoy the many leisure time activities provided by the YMCA, Knights of Columbus, and other organizations. In a single 6-month period, the YMCA reported an estimated attendance of more than 1.5 million soldiers at a wide variety of activities during that period. Richard Walters from Hot Spring County wrote home,
"We can go any place in Camp Pike we want to now, and there are plenty of places to go. You don't get lonesome because you don't have time. We wash our own clothes and dishes and 1,000 other things to do, and then drill 8 hours a day, and you don't feel like going out at night.
Soldiers with passes could leave the camp and take the train to Little Rock, Hot Springs, or other locations to enjoy the amenities. But in the case of baseball, the game came to them. Arkansas had a law prohibiting sporting events on Sundays, the one day soldiers at Camp Pike did not train. The owner of the Little Rock Travelers wanted to build a ball field at the camp and offer Sunday games featuring the Travelers as well as exhibition games with some of the teams that held their spring training in Hot Springs.
Apparently what happened is that the owner of the Little Rock Travelers, we have the Arkansas Travelers, so it's really it's the same minor league team, decided to build the stadium out there because at that time in Arkansas, as many states had, there were laws against organized sports and those sorts of activities on Sunday. And apparently he wanted Sunday baseball. So he built this early in 1918. So it was only, maybe 6, 8, 10 months at the most after Camp Pike construction began. Builds this, minor league team's going to play there, and they did actually play games there.
Construction on the ball field, which eventually had seating for 8,000 fans, began in early March 1918 and was completed 3 weeks later with seating for 2,500. The first series was a 5-game exhibition between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Boston Red Sox, and the crowd got to see Babe Ruth hit a home run in the second game. Just as Camp Pike was completed and life was settling into a routine, the war ended. On October 3, 1918, Germany began negotiation on an armistice and signed the final document on November 11th. The War Department shifted its focus from fighting the war to transitioning to peacetime. On December 5, 1918, the War Department selected Camp Pike as a center for demobilization for troops designated for discharge. And on January 4, 1919, the camp was also designated as a site to rehabilitate wounded soldiers, especially men who had lost the use of limbs. This began Camp Pike's transition from a training center to its current iteration as Camp Joseph T. Robinson.
The in-between years were interesting because there was a lot of changes going on. One of the things that they created at Camp Pike during those in-between years, after 1922, when the state took it over, was they had a civilian military training center. And they brought civilians out to train them for short periods of time in military maneuvers. In the early 30s, however, for about a month, not quite a month, the commander, and they would change commanders quite a bit of this center, was a colonel. Nobody ever heard of him really except from his area, but his name was Harry S. Truman. During the Roosevelt years, we're in the New Deal. One of the programs he started was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and there was a CCC camp, and it lasted throughout much of the 30s. The name was changed in 1938 because Joseph T. Robinson, who was a very powerful senator, former governor just for a very short time, a senator from Arkansas died. And so they decided to change the name to an Arkansan. Today, if you go down I-40 and you're getting close to the exit, which is exit 150, the Burns Park exit, you'll see a sign that says Camp Robinson, Camp Pike, or Camp Pike, Camp Robinson. Camp Pike today is on Camp Robinson. It's using the old name, and it is the area that is used by the Army, Navy, and Marine reserves. It's a small area, but they're using that original name.
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers trained or demobilized at Camp Pike during World War I, including the 87th Division, the only large unit trained at the camp that entered service in Europe. The site has served the nation through 2 world wars and continues to be an important asset for Arkansas. Today it is the home of the Arkansas National Guard.
Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just as sharp as mine. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 you're surely looking fine. As better than dust to dust. If the camels don't get you, the Fatimas must. Good morning, Mr. Zip, 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 with your haircut just a shot at, your haircut just a shot at, your haircut just a shot at mine. Good morning.